Doug and I were watching this morning, and we were talking about just how extraordinary it is that Trump is our president, that he became president, that he's now been returned to the presidency. And we were talking about just how awful Barack Obama was and how radically he changed the country.
To discover these documents and find these documents that really pointed to President Obama directing his national security leaders in James Clapper and John Brennan to manufacture this January 2017 intelligence community assessment.
Something strange happens when two people who rarely agree suddenly aim their sarcasm at the same target. The room gets quiet, the facts start flying, and the halo slips a little. Megyn Kelly and Tulsi Gabbard step into that moment, poking holes in old speeches, polished myths, and recycled talking points. What follows is a rapid-fire roast mixed with uncomfortable truths, unexpected angles, and jokes sharp enough to make history books sweat. Stay curious and question everything you thought.
They stole his first term as president. These absolute liars who run around trying to act like they're the protectors of democracy completely ruined it, tried to undermine it at every turn and at the highest levels with lies.
I think it's a disservice to the American people that former President Obama's office and others who are criticizing the transparency that is being delivered by releasing these documents. They are doing a disservice to the American people and trying to deflect away from their culpability.
Barack Obama's reputation has been buffed and polished like a celebrity selfie run through a dozen filters, magically blurring every flaw and turning routine political moves into moments of supposed poetry. But the second Megyn Kelly and Tulsi Gabbard start circling the narrative, the flattering lighting shorts out, and the whole production is left exposed.
I did care about this little ditty here, Maureen, where he decided to give us a little insight into his relationship with Michelle. Here it is, SOT 29.
Since I left office, I have spent over 8 years now trying to dig myself out of a hole with Michelle. And that's been challenging, but I feel like I'm making progress.
The carefully curated image of calm wisdom starts to look more like a well-rehearsed performance, complete with applause cues, selective memory, and a fan base trained to clap before the sentence finishes forming.
Full attack on the American people who deserve the truth. They deserve to have faith and trust in the integrity of our democratic republic, which has been undermined by President Obama through his direction of this manufactured fake intelligence document, knowing that it was filled with lies and knowing that it would and could then be used for all of the actions that came after.
What makes this unraveling so entertaining is not loud outrage or cartoonish anger, but the quiet, methodical way the mythology gets poked until it starts leaking. Megyn Kelly's angle lands first, cutting through the sentimental fog with the precision of someone who has spent years watching narratives get polished into fairy tales. The presidency is often remembered as a time of eloquent speeches and dignified pauses, yet the substance behind the style rarely gets the same affectionate recall. Policies that promised unity somehow delivered deeper divisions, and decisions sold as thoughtful compromises often manage to disappoint every side at once. The humor comes from pointing out that being well-spoken does not magically transform political contradictions into moral victories, no matter how smooth the delivery sounds on a teleprompter. Tulsi Gabbard slides in from a different direction, carrying the weight of someone who once belonged to the same political family and knows exactly where the skeletons are kept. Her criticism hits harder because it feels less like an ambush and more like a disappointed post-game analysis from someone who expected better execution. The image of principled leadership starts to wobble when foreign policy decisions are examined without the soft focus lens, revealing strategies that created chaos abroad while being praised as cautious and sophisticated at home.
I'm almost breaking even at the moment.
Oh my God. It's perfect.
He's telling the truth.
Yeah, it's the other side of the first side we always cover, which is her and how miserable she is.
Again, I know we've talked about this at length and it feels like a real puzzle for the ages, but why is he still whipping himself? Why is he still wearing the hair shirt? Why?
The joke writes itself when peace prizes and drone strikes start appearing in the same paragraph of history. The contrast becomes the punchline because Obama's brand was always built on the idea of being above the mess, floating gracefully over partisan brawls while delivering hope in perfectly measured syllables. Gabbard treats that brand like a fragile product label, peeling it back slowly to show a list of ingredients that do not quite match the advertised benefits. The laughter grows from recognizing how often charisma was mistaken for clarity and how frequently style was allowed to stand in for substance without too many uncomfortable follow-up questions. The economy offers one of the richest sources of irony because the recovery narrative has been repeated so often that it now sounds like a lullaby. Jobs numbers were celebrated, markets were soothed, and optimism was packaged as progress. Yet many communities never felt that rebound in any tangible way. Kelly's critique highlights how the applause drowned out the fine print, where wage stagnation lingered and inequality widened while the administration took victory laps. The humor sharpens when the gap between glowing headlines and everyday reality becomes impossible to ignore without laughing at how confidently the story was sold.
Director Gabbard, give me your response to what we heard from former President Obama there. He's saying that none of this makes any sense, that this is a distraction. What do you say to that?
It's the art of deflection coming from former President Obama, as well as his friends who are still in Congress today, and Senator Warner and Congressman Jim Himes, really all basically saying that exact same statement, which doesn't actually address the issue that was revealed in great detail in the over 100 documents that we released last week.
Healthcare follows close behind, carrying promises that aged faster than a carton of milk left in the sun. What was presented as a compassionate overhaul quickly became a labyrinth of mandates, premiums, and bureaucratic confusion that required its own user manual. Kelly's perspective underscores the frustration of watching a policy celebrated as transformative, while many Americans found themselves paying more for less flexibility. The sarcastic edge emerges from the realization that complexity was marketed as progress, and confusion was treated as an acceptable side effect of visionary leadership. Foreign policy might be where the shine dulls the fastest, because the language of restraint often masks actions that looked remarkably aggressive when viewed without rhetorical cushioning. Drone warfare expanded quietly, interventions multiplied under different names, and moral lectures were delivered alongside strategies that fueled instability. Kelly's commentary highlights the contradiction of condemning endless wars while perfecting more efficient ways to conduct them from a distance. The laughter turns dark when the contrast between public virtue signaling and behind-the-scenes decision-making becomes too obvious to ignore.
Speaking of Barack Obama, he decided to drop a post on X today, and I thought, okay, maybe in the wake of the Pete Hegseth presser, he's going to say something like, no matter how you feel about the Iranian strike, hats off to our, boys in blue, our guys in the bombers. He went a different way. This is what it was.
Curious how you're thinking about this eulogy specifically in the moment and all the tensions that you just brought out.
I didn't even want to talk. I was so mad. Part of the reason I think I ended up having anything to say at that moment was when I heard some of the victims' families forgive the shooter. And I thought, all right.
Meanwhile, Gabbard's military background adds weight to that critique because it strips away the abstraction and forces attention onto real consequences rather than carefully phrased justifications. The polished image of thoughtful deliberation falters when measured against the human cost of decisions that were framed as reluctant necessities. The sarcasm flows naturally from the idea that eloquence can somehow offset accountability, as though poetic language has the power to erase the fallout of policy choices once the speech ends and the cameras turn off. Domestically, the promise of unity serves as another recurring punchline, because few administrations have talked so much about healing divides while presiding over their steady expansion. Kelly points out how critics were often dismissed as backward or uneducated, even as the rhetoric claimed to rise above such labeling. The irony becomes comedic when calls for civility are paired with subtle condescension, creating a tone that manages to alienate while pretending to embrace. It becomes difficult not to laugh at the performance of inclusivity that somehow excluded anyone unwilling to applaud on cue. Gabbard reinforces that point by noting how dissent within the party was often treated as betrayal rather than engagement, turning the promise of open dialogue into a one-way lecture. The humor sharpens when the image of intellectual openness clashes with the reality of rigid orthodoxy, where certain questions are simply not allowed to be asked without social penalties. Watching that contradiction unfold feels like witnessing a magician insist the trick is honest while nervously guarding the sleeves.
The intelligence community had one assessment, that Russia did not have the intent or capability to try to impact the outcome of the U.S. election leading up to Election Day. The same assessment was made after Donald Trump was elected by the American people as president in 2016, defeating Hillary Clinton. And it wasn't until after that pulled President's Daily Brief document that you referenced that the Principals Committee was called in the National Security Council, and President Obama then directed Obama's DNI James Clapper to lead the effort to create this new intelligence community assessment.
Media adoration plays a starring role in this comedy because the protective bubble around Obama often felt less like journalism and more like brand management. Kelly's critique leans into how scandals that would have dominated news cycles under other presidents were downplayed, reframed, or politely ignored. The laughter grows from recognizing the double standard, where transparency was praised while scrutiny was selectively applied. It becomes a running joke when the press congratulates itself for tough reporting while avoiding the toughest questions entirely. Gabbard's angle exposes how that media shield affected policy accountability, allowing decisions to slide by without meaningful challenge as long as the tone remained calm and the optics stayed polished. The sarcasm lands when the idea of holding power to account is replaced by a mutual admiration society, complete with glowing profiles and celebratory retrospectives. The audience laughs not because the situation is harmless, but because the disconnect between image and reality becomes absurdly clear. Race relations add another layer of irony because expectations were sky high and outcomes were far more complicated. Kelly addresses how symbolic milestones were often treated as solutions in themselves, while deeper issues continued to fester beneath the surface.
Let's see if maybe this is a way America can hear me at this moment. Go back to that day 10 years ago. What I think binds it together, all these different strands, a case upholding healthcare, a case declaring same-sex marriage part of our constitutional protections, of mourning. I think what pulls it all together is that no one person did any of that.
So he's sitting around on a June Thursday thinking about himself.
The humor arises from watching symbolism receive standing ovations while practical progress struggled to find a microphone. It becomes uncomfortable in a way that invites laughter because acknowledging the gap feels like breaking an unspoken rule of the narrative. Gabbard contributes by pointing out how identity was frequently leveraged as a shield against criticism, turning legitimate policy debates into moral minefields. The sarcasm flows from observing how quickly discussions shifted from substance to virtue signaling, making it nearly impossible to evaluate decisions without being accused of impure motives. The joke, if it can be called that, lies in how effectively complexity was reduced to slogans while claiming intellectual superiority. Climate policy and environmental rhetoric offer another opportunity for comedic contrast, because lofty speeches often outpaced tangible action. Kelly highlights how international agreements were celebrated as historic, even when their enforcement mechanisms were weak or symbolic. The laughter comes from the realization that announcing ambition is far easier than implementing it, especially when political cost enters the equation. Watching applause replace accountability becomes a familiar gag that never quite loses its sting. Gabbard underscores the frustration of missed opportunities, noting how bold language created expectations that were never fully met.
That I led at ODNI that we released last week, Friday, provided a lot of those foundational building blocks and proof for what we know happened. The report that we released today, the House Intelligence Committee Oversight Majority Staff report that investigated that January 2017 assessment that President Obama had manufactured with fake intelligence in order to achieve, knowingly using false intelligence in order to get to the conclusion that he wanted to promote to the American people that Putin had acted in favor of President Trump winning that election in 2016.
The sarcasm sharpens when the legacy is examined, and the gap between promise and delivery remains visible. It feels like applauding a trailer for a movie that never quite made it to theaters, leaving audiences to imagine how great it could have been. The cult of personality surrounding Obama becomes the ultimate punchline because it allowed personal likability to overshadow structural outcomes. Kelly emphasizes how charm became a political asset so powerful that it insulated decisions from critique, turning disagreement into heresy. The humor emerges from recognizing how quickly rational analysis gave way to emotional attachment, as though questioning policy was equivalent to insulting a favorite celebrity. Gabbard brings that point home by highlighting how leadership should be measured by results rather than vibes, a concept that sounds obvious until it collides with reality. The sarcasm lands when the applause meter becomes the primary metric of success, leaving uncomfortable data points quietly swept aside. Watching that process unfold feels like observing a talent show where charisma trumps competence, and the judges never seem to notice.
Left progressive agenda. I mean, it was infamous. Like he was more dangerous than any politician that's followed because he was so affable. And he had his folksy way of talking. And, people were like, I like him. And they felt good about themselves. They were voting for the first black president. So it was like he had all this momentum as this agent of hope and change, like a great slogan. And they felt good about themselves. And then he did things that should make you feel good about yourselves, when it comes to changes.
As the script barrels forward, the cumulative effect of these critiques creates a comedic rhythm built on contrast rather than cruelty. The laughter is not driven by personal insults, but by the steady exposure of contradictions that were long disguised as virtues. Each policy area becomes another thread pulled from the same carefully woven tapestry, revealing how much of the image depended on collective agreement not to look too closely. The brilliance of pairing Megyn Kelly and Tulsi Gabbard in this takedown lies in their different starting points leading to the same conclusion. One approaches from a skeptical media lens, the other from within the political ecosystem that once celebrated the very figure now under scrutiny. Their overlap creates a sense of inevitability, as though the critique was always waiting for the right moment to be voiced clearly. The humor intensifies because the agreement feels unexpected, making each shared observation land with extra weight.
Line by line goes through it, dissecting and debunking the knowing falsehoods and lies that were included in that assessment with the specific intent to undermine the legitimacy of President Trump, to subvert the will of the American people who had just voted to elect Donald Trump in 2016, and to, in essence, launch this years-long coup against President Trump that lasted throughout the 4 years of his administration back in 2016.
By the time the dust settles, Barack Obama's legacy no longer looks like a marble statue bathed in flattering light, but like a complex, imperfect record that benefits greatly from selective memory. The sarcasm works because it invites laughter at the process of myth-making itself, rather than demanding allegiance to a different hero. It turns the audience into co-conspirators, quietly acknowledging how easily narratives can harden into unquestioned truth. What remains is a reminder wrapped in jokes and irony, suggesting that eloquence should never be confused with effectiveness, and that good vibes are not a substitute for good outcomes. The script keeps moving, never pausing to lecture, letting the humor do the heavy lifting while the facts hum underneath. The destruction is not loud or explosive, but methodical and relentless, like a slow reveal that leaves little room for denial. In the end, the comedy lingers because it feels earned, built on observation rather than outrage, and delivered through a lens that values skepticism over sentimentality. The myth fades, the laughter echoes, and the legacy stands exposed not as a disaster or a triumph, but as a cautionary tale about what happens when style becomes the star and substance is expected to keep up.